Good afternoon, everybody, here from the Spotlight Studio at the ESGE Days in Barcelona. We are back with another, I think, exciting session, this time about carbon emissions, CO2 management, and we have had discussions and topics and sessions here about waste management, about green endoscopy, and now what we are going to address now in the next 20 minutes is how to measure all this, how to put numbers and figures on it, because we are in medicine and medicine likes figures, and it's important to come to good conclusions, for example, about different treatments and what their CO2 output is. That's the topic for this session. I have three very distinguished guests here with me today who are the world experts in this field. Heiko Pohl. Heiko, you are a gastroenterologist and professor in Dartmouth in the United States. João Neves, you are a gastroenterologist in Portugal at the Algarve coast. And Thomas Rösch, you are the head of endoscopy in Hamburg, Germany. So we have the two experts here on either side of me who know how these things can be measured. And we will Thomas and I will question them about this and have a good discussion with them, because this is a field which is just starting and there's a lot of uncertainty. And maybe I can start with you, Heiko, because you have been very interested in this for some years, and you are interested in environment protection in general, as I know. So can you give us a little introduction in the measurement of CO2 output, and you can go right into probably our field, endoscopy, if you think that's doable.
Yeah, thank you. This is working, yeah. So hello, everyone. So I don't know how many of you have measured your own carbon footprint. Show of hands, how many have measured your carbon footprint like over a day, over a year? Because there are several apps available. Doesn't look like anyone. We hear a lot of this in the news. Environmental footprint is one of the environmental impacts that we have. Typically, it's a measure of greenhouse gas emissions or global warming potential, as it's called. And I think, simply put, there are three different sources for greenhouse gases based on the greenhouse gas protocol: Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. Scope 1 emission is everything that you're generating yourself. Let's say at home you have a wood furnace or a coal furnace. What the emission generate from this furnace, that's Scope 1 emissions. Or in the endoscopy unit, the CO2 insufflation that you use, that's Scope 1 emission, which is actually a very minor proportion. Or the inhalation gases for anesthesia, that would be Scope 1 emissions. Scope 2 emissions it's all the electricity that's being used, like secondary, based on, whatever you use for electricity. And Scope 3 is more or less what we call supply chain, everything else we use. So for instance, if you have a snare, or you have your scope, or you have any additional supplies, this is Scope 3 emission. And that's a pretty complicated thing, because that includes everything from manufacturing it, to transporting it to your endoscopy unit, to using it in some ways, including packaging and all that stuff, and then disposing it. It's called cradle-to-grave emission assessment. So this is a general overview of greenhouse gas emissions.
And Joao, would you like to chime in and start talk about measuring all this? It sounds complicated.
It is complicated, but I would just like to point out something, and probably a comment here. Heiko, do you believe that we should carry on with cradle-to-grave analysis, or stick to net-to-grave right now?
I did not hear what analysis?
If we should stick to cradle-to-grave, or be a bit more simple and go from net-to-grave.
So I think what you're asking is, should we measure the carbon footprint from the manufacturing of some instrument to the use, or should we also include to the grave, to the disposal of the instrument?
Exactly.
I think it should be everything. There's a lot to say about this, but I think the manufacturers, they have some responsibility in how it's being disposed, and currently it's not the case. That also is very important for plastic pollution and microplastics, all that stuff. So again, carbon emission is just one aspect of environmental impact, and there are other aspects that we talk about, like plastic that we see, like the waste and the stuff we accumulate at the end of the day. So carbon emission is just one point. So I think we should have an entire assessment of everything.
Because that gets directly to my point. So the measurement itself gets a bit more tricky because you don't have all of the information. So that's why we enter some sort of assumptions, and we tend to use databases that are already collected. Of course, we can also do the analysis of the devices themselves. For example, you can go through thermodynamics analysis, which is a bit more tricky because it's not part of us to do it as endoscopists. So we need the intervention of specialists and experts in the field, for example, bioengineers and people that are directly connected to the analysis of the devices. So that's why I asked Heiko about this, because to a certain extent, we know what we do with our own devices when we use them, but we don't know the trajectory behind.
What comes after
so
and
the
before,
upstream
yes.
of it.
Sounds like a lot of bureaucracy. Thomas, I know that you like to take the train, so you're conscious about these things. But you also, you don't like bureaucracy and more certification. So what do you think, that aspect of it?
Well, I think I'm from a generation who was generally a little bit unaware. So this hit me as a clinical researcher and also editor quite unexpected. So when I get one of those papers, I'm usually confused. So I try to break it down from my perspective to several facts. I think we are still in the period of measuring. So establishing the tools, what should we measure, what's the reference, by the way? That's also interesting. So there are a few figures I stick to. So an average European citizen produces, I think, 10 tons, right, per year. If you fly, it's 100 grams per kilometer in person. So New York, Frankfurt, New York and back, it's roughly 1 ton. And a hospital per se, I've got various figures, is between 1,000 and 5,000 tons or so, right? With 500 to 1,000 beds and ICU. So, and
Per day?
No, per year, I think.
Per year?
Right? But that's, for me, it's important. I get these micro abstracts with kilograms and tons here and there, and I don't know at all how to interpret. So first thing is to establish measurement tools, right? What do we do? And there's a big warning, because what we are facing is the rise of a certification industry. So you pay 10,000 euros and you get a green label for your meeting. And we did this enterprise for some meetings, EndoClub and others, and we discovered that these guys, they use models, assumptions, so they're selling you almost nothing. So I think that's the first thing for us as a scientific community. We should establish these tools by ourselves and make them freely available to everybody rather than paying money. And if we have done this, I think we have accomplished a lot. Number two, then, very briefly, is that we should look at the figures, percentages, and what we can realistically change. So whether it's running after waste and measuring grams, or it's putting, like Alex Mining showed, the central heating down for by 2 degrees and save 20%. So as a general comment.
Okay, let's be specific. Joao, you were talking about it. I mean, some of it needs to be modeling, I guess, but it's good to have real data for the things that we can control. For example, our equipment that we are using. Where are we in the field of endoscopy? What have we as a field, measured already? For example, let's take a common procedure such as a colonoscopy. Has somebody measured the impact of that procedure, and are these data freely available to people to use?
You have a lot of data, and specifically in the field of colonoscopy and going a bit further, for example, between piecemeal EMR and ESD, we already have some data on that. Mathieu Pioche recently published a paper on that. And I think we need to start thinking not only about efficiency for the procedure itself, because we know that ESD is easier to perform in expert centers. But if we put ESD in contrast with piecemeal EMR, we know that not only the index colonoscopy, but also the subsequent follow-ups tend to be more advantageous for the ESD field. But if you localize, if you optimize this strategy and you put things into local centers, we know that piecemeal EMR becomes a bit more advantageous, because mainly what we can contribute as endoscopists is to reduce some procedures. And by reducing some procedures, we also reduce the transportation of patients, which we know already that's one of the major culprits in between this.
Thomas. That would be one of my basic questions. So should we rather avoid a colonoscopy and save much more than thinking about which snare to take.
We should maximize appropriateness, I think, because there are still a lot of procedures that we do every single day that probably we don't need to do, actually. It's that old motto, doing less yet doing better. So we need to optimize strategies within our endoscopy field. We need to know which endoscopies are appropriate, which ones we can avoid, but also we need to think about our patients. So efficacy and safety should be the rule number one.
Yes. So there's efficacy, there is adverse events, there is harms and burdens, and then there is CO2 output as an additional thing, and all these things needs to be put into context.
Exactly, all of this needs to be integrated. We cannot talk about environmental impacts, we cannot talk about sustainability as a solo thing. We have to incorporate this in our daily work routine as part of the endoscopy.
Yeah. And taking it a step further, Heiko, we are working on this project where we're taking this into the research itself as an additional outcome measure. Would you like to address the audience, enlighten the audience about that?
I mean, it's a very complex field question. So there are many things that were raised. The question in general is, why are we measuring it at all? Right? So we're measuring it so that we can find an intervention to reduce our impact, whatever it is. And we might find that our impact is little of what we can do, because the major sources of whatever environmental impact is not coming from us, even if we have a huge mountain of trash that we collect at the end of the day. So why are we doing this in general? I think we want to have our attention to it. It's more or less about a cultural change that we want to inspire. At least I hope. I would like my kids and my grandkids to grow up in a healthy planet, a healthy world. And so the little things that we do can have a big impact. And that is, I think, I'm convinced of this. And that is true for every field of our activities. May it be in the endoscopy unit, but may it also be in our patient interactions, or may it be in research. And in research, I think it's appropriate to think about how are we conducting research when we organize this. Do we have electronic forms, or do we have paper forms? How many letters do we send out? How many travels do we assign to the subjects, the patients? So we are prospectively trying to measure the environmental impact of different strategies and randomized trials that are being planned and started to be conducted, and see what the difference is between like an endoscopy arm and a surgical arm, and see what the difference is in general. That's another, as Joe was saying, another argument for one or the other, aside from the efficacy and safety and aside from the cost.
So that means after every randomized trial, like FIT versus colonoscopy, there's another paper measuring the impact. Should we do this with snare A versus snare B? No.
So two different questions. So yes, I think we should do this, so to just understand and learn about this. What's the environmental effect of different strategies? You can also translate that into cost, which is difficult, but you can do that. So environmental cost, ecological and environmental cost analysis, in addition, not just cost analysis. And different paper, it doesn't, I mean, just learning about this, understanding it, and then see how we can incorporate this and whether it makes a difference.
But isn't the major impact doing less?
Well, that's...
Full stop.
The interesting part is doing the right thing in endoscopy is actually doing also the right green thing in endoscopy. If you follow the guidelines already, you would reduce your environmental impact because you would do less over-treatment, over-diagnosis, over-utilization. And so there are numerous examples of this. The other thing is also guidelines sometimes give you options, and one is a less invasive option or a less environmental impactful option than the other. Let's just take HCC screening. You can do this with ultrasound or with a regular MRI, just an example. Similar with variceal screening, there are now different options. You don't always have to do an EGD. So I think just being open to alternatives, thinking about this into your everyday practice might help to change things.
So what about incentives, Joe? I mean, how do we get people to, for example, do ultrasound for HCC surveillance than MRI? Should we talk to the people who give us the money, the people who make the DRGs, to say, look, maybe you should look at that and provide less money to the or more money to the more environmentally friendly options? Would that be something to consider?
Yes, and I believe that it goes a bit according to what Eiko was talking about in terms of monetary assessment. And I think we need to introduce that, because when we talk about sustainability, you not only talk about environmental impact, you also talk about economics, you also talk about social. So I think you need to address the boards. You need to explain to them, look, these are the data. Of course, we have this environmental impact. We have some measures to reduce this. If we perform an ultrasound, it's better for the environment compared to an EMRR. Or you can also present the monetary data. And I think that's probably the most impactful measure for the boards themselves, at least where we at the moment, because this is a field in evolution, and I think we're starting to understand a bit more about sustainability in general, and a bit more in terms of the environmental assessment, the environmental impact, but we still need to think about the others that are not into the field. So I believe that you're absolutely right. We need to present the data to people, and we need to present them monetary data. I think that's a big incentive.
How do we find, I mean, for the audience here, if there's people here, people are eating their lunch and thinking, okay, how do I find data on what is environmentally friendly in my areas? Are there databases, are there websites where you can look up this stuff? Or do you need to go to papers that Thomas publishes in GUT or other journals? Where do we find this?
You mean like carbon footprint assessment of related to our work?
Yes. For this colonoscopy or that colonoscopy or this snare or that snare or EMR, ESD, I mean, where are the data?
Yeah, so there's one big database. It's called Healthcare LCA. You can Google this, and it's publicly available. It's organized by all the published papers, and then you can look at the papers, what the source is. But they also give you an overview. In our own work, we're trying to make this public, what we assessed over the past 2 years. It's a question of how you post it so that people have access to it. And I think if you just put into PubMed like carbon footprint analysis and endoscopy, you find still a fairly low number of papers that is easily to digest for you. One more thing to what Thomas was saying, shall we now do it for every snare or every little instrument? I think it would be helpful for us to help make decisions on purchasing situation. If you have a snare A and a snare B and we like them, equally, and the cost is equal, well, I would definitely use the snare with lower environmental impact. So if we had that information, that helps us to decide it. The other thing is also, if we do it, coming back to the who's doing the analysis, industry is being encouraged, to put it mildly, to also do their environmental impact analysis, because they might say, oh, you have this environmental impact for snare A, that's not true. Well, then show us what you did so that we can understand it better.
Will it be turned back in the US now?
Will the whole thing turn back? Oh, the US is in...
I guess so.
It doesn't matter. Main thing is the snare is produced in the US.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking now about terrorists or the political...
Heiko's staying here. He's not going back.
Well, yeah, that's good.
Okay, everybody. I think this was an interesting discussion. There is data out there that you can use. You're already eating, actually, I think, all vegetarian lunch, because this is part of the carbon footprint thing at the ESG days. It is obvious that if we all would have stayed at home in our beds this morning and not traveled to Barcelona, it would probably have benefited the environment. However, there is a value in being here, in meeting, in discussing. So I think it's, as everything in life, it's about, it's a trade-off between benefit and harms and burden. And as these speakers have been explaining, carbon analysis are here to stay, but there's a lot of other things to consider also. Thank you very much for watching and listening. We'll be back with another session this afternoon. Thank you.